Welcome to the Wheeler Center's live stream chat with Arnold Zable. My name is Sami Shah, and I'll be your host today as we all sit in our living rooms, on our couches across Melbourne, perhaps across the world. Who knows where you're tuning in from? And we're going to have a remarkable and wonderful conversation with the remarkable and wonderful Arnold. We are live streaming tonight from the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation. We acknowledge their elders, past and present, and the elders of all lands this event reaches. I would also like to take a moment to thank the Wheeler Center itself, as well as the wonderful Montalto in Red Hill South. This event was originally programmed to take place as part of the Books and Ideas at Montalto series. We would have been sitting here amongst beautiful woodland views and vistas. We would have been sipping wine, and we would have been having this conversation in one of the most remarkable of venues. We make do with what we can in these strange, strange times. Antipodes would have been the bookseller providing Arnold's books there. However, if you do want to purchase Arnold's books, particularly The Watermill, which is his most recent one, which is what we'll be discussing today, please avail any and all of the independent bookstores across Melbourne, many of whom, by the way, are now offering free and discounted shipping at the moment. Arnold Zable. All right. This is tough because there's so many ways of describing Arnold Zable. He is a writer, he's a traveler, he is many, many things, but he is more than anything else, I think he is a storyteller. Arnold tells stories about life, Arnold tells stories about other people, Arnold tells the stories about Melbourne, about the other countries, and he tells them with such beauty, care, and consideration that they become our stories as well. He is known for his affectionate accounts of the characters and suburbs of Melbourne itself, in particularly the Cafe Scheherazade book, as well as The Fighter, and his portraits of people from the places that he's traveled and encountered. Arnold is also a human rights advocate, has written across a number of forms, including fiction, travelogues, and biographies. His new work, The Watermill, brings together many of these threads, and it's a quartet of stories from his life and travels, carrying the reader from the remote provinces of China to Yiddish Poland, from Kurdish Iran to present day Melbourne. It contains stories of people learning to recover from lifetimes of suffering and trauma, and those that don't sometimes make it out the other side. Thank you, Arnold, for joining us.
It's wonderful to be here.
Arnold, the book, The Watermill, it is, I'm not even sure I know what number book this is of yours at this point. You've been so prolific with your writing. I have read fairly, at this point, I think I can say everything that you've written in print. It's shot up to my top two of yours, the other one being The Fighter. But it's an interesting book because it's a collection of stories of other people's lives. And these are the lives that you've encountered in your journeys. And the first thing I have to ask, because I wondered while reading it, is why these stories, why these lives in particular are the ones that you've decided to tell?
Well, look, I began writing the story which is set in China, the title story, which I must say I loved writing. I loved crafting that story. I'd always wanted to tell that story. So I started writing about my stay in China back in 1984-85, a very special time when China was coming out of a terrible trauma of the Cultural Revolution. Every book that I've written, every story I've written is actually an exploration. I start off and it begins to happen. And I'm not sure where it's going to take me. And this actually took me to a quartet of stories. It went way beyond the story about the watermill, because at a certain point, I began to realize that this story contains echoes of other stories, others encounters I've had in my travels. And so it expanded, and then one story led to the next, and it finally became that quartet.
There is a theme that does connect them, and you're right. And if I can understand it, at least the theme that I picked up on was, and I'm sure many other people would pick up on this as well when they read the book, is that there is a serenity belying a long history of trauma and suffering and everything under the surface. And that serenity is how we make our daily lives work when we have this long history of suffering. But The one thing that's missing in all of these, at least for me, was you. How does a 1984 a young Arnold Zable end up in a remote agricultural college in China?
Well, I've always loved adventure. I've always loved travel. I've always loved taking risks too. And at that stage in my life, I was in my early 30s, and I saw an ad for this position in a remote part of China. I took it down, put it in my wallet, and left it there. And a few months later, I was going through my wallet, and there it was, and there was about a week left before the deadline. So I sent it off, and lo and behold, I get an invitation to come and work in this agricultural college, and well, I took the chance, and I'll always remember on the journey over there. Back in 84, 85, China wasn't on the radar the way it is now. It was still coming out of its isolation, and I remember that kind of romantic notion. I'm going to the Forbidden City, because my first port of call was Beijing. I'm going to the Forbidden City. So I embarked on a journey with great curiosity and a degree of excitement about what lay ahead.
Curiosity and excitement about who you were for the locals?
Oh, yes. Because I was in a remote province, it was a 2.5-day journey by train from Beijing to get to the southwest, to Guizhou, which is lesser known than the other southwestern provinces like Sichuan to the north and Yunnan to the south. And it really was a remote province. And I was the first Westerner to work in this particular college for I think 20 years before China went into a kind of isolation. And there were journeys I took, which form part of that story, the Watermill, where I actually do go to places where they hadn't seen a person, a fair-skinned person, a Waigoren, the outside person, a foreigner, for many years, and children actually stared at me because they'd never seen anyone that looked like me.
How did you ingratiate yourself to them? How does a person who's completely alien to the local environment make them lower their guards, tell their stories? How do you connect on that level?
Well, I don't look at life that way. I don't look at things like how do I get people to open up. I just love conversation. I love being open to the people I meet. I love landscape. I love place and engaging with the landscape. And if you are interested in people and their place, they're interested in you. It's as simple as that, really. And if you are curious, they love your curiosity. They love the fact that you think they matter. I was surrounded by countryside, and it only took a few minutes to descend from the college to go out into the countryside. And I was walking through extraordinary landscapes, farmers who are artists in terracing, and walking from village to village where I became known, and it was there were times when I thought to myself, I am so glad I made that decision to come here, because I am in such a different place, and I'm getting such a different view of life. And it did help that on my nightly walks, occasionally villagers would come out with Maltai. It's a special spirit that's made in Guizhou. I think it's stronger than vodka. And so one of the first Chinese words I learned was "gambei," drink up. So, yeah, it was a very, I guess it was a very engaging experience, but also unforgettable. And I knew that one day I would write about it. I had a feeling that one day I would have to record this.
I want to actually just pause for 1 second, kind of go down that side road of process, of so the details in here, the details of something that took place so long ago are very vivid indeed. And how much of this is reliant on your memory of things now versus notes you made then? What is on your way of making sure you record the details at the time so you can remember them in the future?
Well, at that stage, I wasn't a writer, quote unquote. My
Hmm.
first book, Jewels and Ashes, hadn't come out. That was a few years later, but I was already a journal keeper. I loved responding with the written word, um, and and I also have a sense when I'm in a place like that it's important to record what's happening to me, and that's the other adventure. You see, one adventure is what's going on around you, but the other adventure is how you record it and respond to it. And in the writing, in the response to it, in that discipline of everyday recording what is happening to you, you discover other meanings, deeper meanings. So, yes, I was keeping a journal without which I couldn't remember those details. But on the other hand, there are moments also when I relied on memory, and I think memory works in an interesting way. Certain things become clearer in a way many years later.
One of the interesting things about all of this is the lack of judgment you provide and present of the people that you encounter. There are people who, for example, in the first story in China, who were believers in China's cultural change, cultural revolution, and took part in the mistreatment and the judgment of others. But you yourself, when you tell about them, you don't judge them. To me, at least, that's how it seems. Has that changed over time? Was there judgment from you then and none now? Or do you maybe now look back and go, they were foolish or they were cruel when at the time you had more empathy?
No, no. One of the one of the great things about travel is that you get to go to a place and see it firsthand, face to face, and
Hmm.
you begin to see the subtleties. We're all, in a way, I guess, subject to our times more than we realise. Uh, it's very easy to judge the way people behave from afar, but how would we behave in similar circumstances? I mean, there were people, especially some of the bureaucrats, the party cadres who worked at the college that were keeping an eye on you,
Hmm.
that I didn't take to. But most of the people responded with great warmth and with great love, and were very well, at a certain point, became very open about what had happened in that kind of madness called the Cultural Revolution. And as one of them said to me, his father had actually ended up becoming imprisoned, and he said to me, "My father was a good man, but then he stepped in that quicksand and began sinking, began being caught up in that accusation and counter accusation." And so I wasn't there to judge. I was there to hear the story and to understand the historical context in which it had taken place.
The owner of the aforementioned Watermill, the person who ran the mill, is someone who, at the start of the book, asks you for a couplet as a gift, as a way of you saying thank you to him for the company he's provided and for the space he's given you. Writing that couplet seems like it was quite a painful and torturous and challenging journey for you. What did you come up with in the end?
Look, it's interesting. Every evening when I went on this walk, I would eventually end up at a bridge, and in the middle of the bridge was a watermill, and I
Hmm.
would go there and sit with the miller. Now the miller didn't speak any English. I spoke very little Chinese, and basically we sat in silence, and you'd hear the thum, 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 as the
Right.
water wheel went round and round and round, and occasionally peasants would come down from the countryside with their grain to be ground, and it was so much serenity in that moment. We just enjoyed each other's company, and he would make me a cup of tea on his pot-bellied stove, or the coal stove he had. And so, look, a couple of weeks before I was due to leave, I took one of my students. My students were agricultural scientists and language teachers, aged from about 18 to 70. And I took one of them with me, and I said, I want to thank the miller for all the times I've spent here, and I'm going in a few weeks' time. And he said, tell the Waigoren, tell the foreigner, that I want him to write a couplet that sums up all the conversations we've had. This miller, there was something more to this miller than his silences. And so I thought, now a couplet is a wonderful classical form in China. You see the hitting above the door, and you see the two lines. One goes vertically on one side and one goes vertically on the other. And the traditional form, there are 3, 5, 7 tones sometimes that match each other. The two lines have conversations. The heading has a certain meaning. And I mean, I could have written a book, I thought, about my experience here, but now I have to do it.
Which you did eventually, yes.
Yes, in 2 lines. The heading was the easiest part, Huashi Watermill. And finally, it came down to this. I come from a distant place to Huashi Watermill. Here I feel at peace. My mind becomes still. Now, the interesting thing is I had this debate. I mean, every word counted. I had a debate within myself. What should I say? My heart becomes still, or my mind becomes still? I settled on mind, but when my student translated it into Chinese characters, the character he used for mind also means heart. And those are those wonderful little moments when you cross a kind of cultural gap and discover something extraordinary about language, both how the limits of translation, but also the beauty of seeking translation.
From China, we go to Cambodia, where it's a very interesting thing. The essay you've written on your experience in Cambodia and the life of people that you've met there. Yes, there is a great deal of grief there. Yes, there is, of course, a great deal of suffering and tragedy, perhaps on a scale almost never seen in the rest of the world. But at the same time, and I've read a lot of stories about Cambodia and a lot of stories from Cambodia. So one of the things I found unique about your experience there was a crackle of creative energy that you seem to have picked up from the people in a period there where they still hadn't fully recovered from Pol Pot's regime at all. It seemed as if there was a drive to make things, to create things, to tell stories, and that caught me by surprise.
Well, that's a wonderful observation, Sami. That energy I encountered, that creative energy, was a surprise. I mean, it's not easy politically in Cambodia at the moment, and it hasn't been for many, many years. But I need to say that I went there once again with a certain purpose, and I was running workshops on behalf of Melbourne Pen with Cambodian writers. So I went in 2013, 14, and 15, and ran workshops in 3 different cities. And I think that also gave me a certain perspective. I was with people who enjoyed having their own creative responses to the world around them, and who also were very engaged. So that was one side of that energy that I encountered. But the other side of it was that paradox that people often experience when they go to countries like Cambodia, where somehow, despite it all, or perhaps in spite of it all, there's a kind of energy and a kind of life force, and also, once again, a kind of beauty in the landscape that really grabbed me. And look, there is also something shocking There are shocking disparities in wealth. You see mansions and five-star hotels in Phnom Penh almost alongside shanty towns. There are people being dispossessed. There are forests being cut down. But at the same time, there are those that are confronting that, and there is also that youthful energy. And that youthful energy is interesting because Cambodia is a country which suffered a genocide, and almost an entire generation of intellectuals, writers, songwriters, artists were wiped out. And so in a way, that gap is there, and you sense this. And the young have to come in and fill that gap in a way. I have to say here, of course, that whenever you talk about a place like Cambodia, you're switching all the time from that optimistic view to that recognition that things are also not right. And the one thing I would say about that genocide that makes it very specific and perhaps different to many other genocides, that's the time of Pol Pot and the killing fields, is that it was an auto-genocide. It wasn't an enemy out there from another race or another group. The people in a way had turned on each other. It was kind of fratricidal. So those ghosts were still around too, I need to say. The ghosts of that time, and how to reconcile with them was an issue.
One of the things you mentioned right now was how the landscape was beautiful and the landscape was inspiring in some ways, but the landscape also told stories in ways that were unique as well. You met a group of young men who were angry with the destruction of their forest, and it wasn't just for the reasons we would assume. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, one of the things that has happened sadly in Cambodia in recent decades is a lot of devastation in terms of forests, cutting down of forests, and the spoils going to the wealthy elite. And so there is a character Y who's a kind of composite character. I don't name people for obvious reasons. And Y is a composite between two students, two writers, young writers that I had in my workshops. And he lived in a remote village in the forest, and the forest was sacred to his people. And then the bulldozers came and the forests were cut down. And where there were once forests, there are now ghosts, he told me. And the forest not only provided livelihood, but the forest was companionship. It was the sounds of the forest, the love of the forest was profound. It was both a place which gave sustenance, but also a kind of sacred space. So yes, not only did it create anger, but also it meant that he, like many other young people, had to leave and make their way to the big cities. And Y is a composite of someone who attended my Phnom Penh and Battambang workshops.
One of the things, and I'm worried that by phrasing this question inelegantly, I might sound as if I'm belittling the suffering of the Cambodians, or I am not properly paying homage to the arts. But bear with me here. So these days, with coronavirus and the quarantine and the isolation, the arts community in particular has been very, very badly hit in terms of income, in terms of earnings. And its recovery hasn't really been prioritized by the government. And you see similar things in governments across the world right now, where, writers, comedians, artists, illustrators, painters, everyone, poets, playwrights, they're not seen as essentials. Yet, when Cambodia came out of the killing fields, an entire generation of intelligentsia had been destroyed, artists had been destroyed, writers had been destroyed, critical thinking had been destroyed. And one of the first things, it seems to me, that people started to try to endeavor to recreate was art. Why is that? Why is there that importance and value that we sometimes forget when it comes down to things like money crunching?
Well, look, art is how we make sense of things. The word expression actually has the prefix ex, which means out. when you go to the Greek island of Ithaca, where my wife's family comes from, and I love going to this island, you don't say cheers, you say exo, tavasana, outside with my problems, which is a wonderful way to toast people. And so expression means getting it out. And I think all artists across the board, whether they're musicians or they're songwriters or they're writers or theatre workers, performers, I think they cotton on to the fact that first you get it out, and in getting it out, you begin to work it out. And certainly that's something I discovered at a young age when I was at home and there was a lot of tension in the house. And I had to learn how to deal with this disturbance, this detention, which had echoes of another genocide. And I discovered that just by going to my bedroom and sitting down and beginning to write, somehow it started to just come out. And since then, I think I've been able to engage with that creative spirit wherever I go. And I think that's what happened in Cambodia. I mean, after all, I was with writers. And one of the interesting things with Cambodia is that the major art form, I think, is songwriting. The love of music is profound, and there are many prolific songwriters, and that's often the medium, I think, through which they communicate best and in the most subtle way.
That same drive to create art and keep it alive, in this case in the form of theatre, as a theatre troupe rose out of the horror of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. It's the third essay in the Watermill. Can you tell us a bit about who it was that needed to create theatre from the Holocaust and how they did it?
Well, I should say here that going back to the last question, art, theatre, performance, songwriting is also a form of resistance in dark times, and there are countless examples of this. So, in the third story, which is called "The Republic of the Stateless," this is a story which, once again, I always knew I had to write. There is a saying, I think it was Ali Wiesel who said this, he said, there are stories that are meant to be told, and not to tell them is to betray them. And I felt this about all the stories I've written in this book. They've come my way. I'm the medium through which the stories are told. And this particular story is very intimate and close to me because the woman at the center of the story, Sonia Lizaron, was a dear friend of mine. She became my son's surrogate grandmother, and she was a very modest, unassuming woman. But I discovered, I knew her for the last 35 years or so of her life when she settled in Melbourne finally. And she was very, very modest. But at a certain point, I began to realize that she had been a co-founder with Sami Feder, the remarkable theatre director, Sami Feder, who became her first husband, of a theatre in the Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp. After it was liberated, the concentration camp, that horrible, horrible camp, became a DP camp. And within weeks, they were talking about founding a theatre. They had already worked in the Benzin ghetto in the late, in 1939, 1940. Sami Feder was trained in Weimar Republic by guys that in a milieu that included Bertolt Brecht and those wonderful directors. And so one of the few stories Sonia told me was about how she got on a bicycle, and she's a wonderful singer and performer, by the way, and she'd been trained in the art of Yiddish cabaret, a very subversive art form, and she cycled around the camp, gathering people who were theatre workers, tailors who could build sets, people with talent, and within a few months, they were premiering this extraordinary cabaret, which confronted their recent suffering in extraordinary circumstances.
And the audience for that cabaret was something they did not have trouble finding. It was people from the camps, it was people who were survivors who clambered to get there and to watch what they were going to present.
Well, look, maybe I'll find something, a little passage to read about the premiere, because the theatre premiered on September 6, 1945, in a tent, a big field tent, which had been used by the Nazis in order to, lecture the elite officers. And some of the lecturers included Himmler and Goebbels. And here it was big enough to fit 1,000 people, but at the premiere, 3,000 people came. They were desperate to see this theatre, which was going to mirror their own lives. In fact, some people just couldn't get in, and there was a near riot. And the British authorities had to bring in tanks in order to quieten the disturbance. And I'll just read you a little passage about that extraordinary night when the Tent Theatre premiered, right? The response of the audience was immediate and visceral. Many wept throughout the production. Some screamed and shouted. Others became hysterical. The performers and the audience were barely distinguishable. They formed a single entity in their expression of loss and grief, offering it up as if in sacrifice to the gods of theatre. The space was reminiscent of the amphitheatres of ancient Greece, returning drama to its origins as a ritual of communal release and exorcism.
That exorcism, that ability of theatre to provide that, and this particular theatre to provide that is something so unique and so valuable that we sometimes forget when it comes to the arts. I mean, you've written plays in which refugees got to tell their own stories, and you worked with so many refugees. For example, we will talk about Behrouz in a bit as well. I'm sure there are many people who have questions about him and his work. Does telling the story of your own personal suffering help people connect to their own suffering as well, or does your suffering co-opt someone else's?
No. Well, it depends on the situation, and every situation is unique. You have to enter this arena with respect, with compassion, and with great care. But the drive is to bear witness to these remarkable things that and the ways in which people do resist, and in this case, in the form of performance and theatre, and I guess that when it comes to, say, let's take the cassette theatre, the concentration. They call themselves the concentration camp theatre. Cassette means concentration camp, and it was called that because Sami Feder had actually performed theatre in hell, in the camps, late at night, when they just cleared a space and they performed the songs of the past, sketches that were subversive but presented in a subtle way that they could get away with it. Mm-hmm. And so, but when they formed the theatre in Bergen-Belsen DP camp, on that night of the premiere and many subsequent performances, they actually reenacted the suffering that they'd undergone. They confronted the reality. They enacted the beginnings of the conflict, the way in which it evolved. They used to stand on stage in striped prison guard. They said, "Here is who we are." Look, I will read you another short passage, mm-hmm. Because it illustrates so beautifully. Yes, here it is. Okay, I think this speaks for itself. Just 2 paragraphs here. There is a photo of 22 members of the troupe dressed in striped prison clothes. They are gathered in front of a stage set headed Ein Laus, dein Tod, one louse, your death, replicating the backdrop for Feder's performance in the Bunzlau labor camp. The shadows of those in the back row fall on a white backdrop. Sami and Sonia can be made out seated side by side in the center row, but no one occupies pride of place. The performers lean on each other. They look directly at the viewer. Their expressions are earnest and confronting, ghostly almost. The trauma is writ on their faces, as too is a collective strength and a sense of defiance. We are here, they seem to say. Take us or leave us. We are not afraid to be seen as we are. One day we may go our separate ways. We may voyage to distant lands and build new lives. But in this moment in time, we are here and we are as one. We bear witness to ourselves and we bear witness to each other. And in our being and our presence, we bear witness to our audience of survivors. When they see us on stage, they see themselves. I think that's it. And at its best, theatre and performance and that private space when you encounter a book is a kind of mirror that reflects your own self back at you in all kinds of ways.
One of the stories in this that wrecked me the most, and maybe it's because it was my own worst fears realized, was that of Faris, the Iraqi Kurd who lost his wife and daughter in the Sea of X disaster. 353 people drowned when it sank. He was one of the few survivors. And night after night, he sings the same lullaby that he used to sing to his daughter. There's a question here we have from Claudia, who sent it in on Twitter. And I feel it's so perfect for this story of Faris's. What impact does displacement have on an individual's memory?
Well, look, it has different impacts on different people. My father dealt with the past very different to my mother. They both lost their families to genocide. But my father, he used to say, I get up in the morning, if I've had a bad dream, I chuck it in a rubbish bin and I get on with life. But my mother was trapped in the past. She felt a sense of betrayal, that life had betrayed her. She could never forgive herself for having survived. It drove her at times into psychic rages. This beautiful woman who had herself been a singer and a performer, now just having to sing her Yiddish songs around the house as she desperately tried to bring her three sons up, and yet it always came back, and that sense of betrayal. A part of that is in Faris also. With Faris, he's a beautiful man, by the way, an extraordinary man, but he still questions what. There were 3 boats that night. Many survivors say that. Why didn't they rescue us? Why did they leave us? Why did they abandon us? My brother, why did they abandon us? But there's something else that needs to be said about this story about Faris. Primo Levi has a wonderful expression. He calls that about storytelling. He says that sometimes a story contains an eloquent episode. An eloquent episode is a kind of way of getting to the heart of the issue. And that story of Zara's lullaby, I knew Faris from within months of him arriving in Australia in 2002, and the disaster took place in October 19, 2001. And but it wasn't until the 10th anniversary of that sinking that I was in his apartment, and he's remarried. He lost his wife and his child to the ocean, Layla and Zara. That it was Majida, this beautiful woman he's married, who comes from a similar background, a Faili Kurd from by way of Iran to Iraq, and then escaping Saddam Hussein. So they shared a similar story. And she said, he sings this lullaby to his daughter in his sleep in Arabic. every night. And of course, at that moment, kind of a chill went through my body. Now, I initially wrote a version of that story for the Age, and I rang up Faris before it was to be published, and I said, I read it to him on the phone. A story like this, you need permission, and his answer was very telling. He said, "Yes, I want you to tell this story on one condition, and that condition is that you have a photo of Zara." And I think that says it all. You know, he wanted her to be memorialized and remembered. So when we're thinking about this issue of memory, it's complex. There is the need to memorialize, and sometimes remaining silent can be an impediment of being able to get on with life. And some are trapped in the memory and tragically but trapped in the memory. And I grew up with that. I grew with someone who was in that state, but I also grew up with other people. I grew up with people who were proud to remember. I grew up with people who had been members of the resistance, who had fought in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, who had acted out many roles during those dark days of the Holocaust. I record a lot of those stories, of course, in my novel Cafe Scheherazade, stories of partisans who went into the forests. And so, yes, look, it's multifaceted, the issue of memory, and it's been an absolute privilege to be a person who's been a medium for those sorts of stories to come to light. And I found almost unfailingly that a sense, if you do it with compassion and respect, that people have a sense of gratitude that their stories are being heard and commemorated.
From stories of land abroad to stories of people being made to feel as if in a land abroad, that they are on a land abroad on their own soil. You also write of the Wurundjeri people's struggles to reclaim their own place. There's a wonderful line you've written. I'm just going to read this out, describing a photo of the Wurundjeri leader, William Barrack. His dignity cut through, and his presence drew people to him. His being transcended his enclosure and undermined the prejudices of those who saw him as a curiosity. Is writing about the local, about the here and the now, different from writing about the foreign?
Yes and no. I think whatever place I write about, place is very important. Place is central, and it's what I love writing about most. I think places speak to you, and I love engaging with landscapes and immersing myself in the landscape, and I think it says a lot about the people and their history when you do this. But of course, Melbourne is my city. I grew up in Melbourne. I think I record local stories. The novel, which I think is the most detailed recording of a locale of my life in Melbourne, is actually Scraps of Heaven, which is set in Carlton when I was in my childhood, and I loved recording that neighbourhood. So it was as much an adventure recording what it was like to be a child in the streets of post-war, working class, multicultural Carlton, as it is to write about perhaps more exotic places like China, a remote province in China, for example, or Ithaca, as I do in the novel Sea of Many Returns. So yeah, but of course, once again, there are all kinds of ethical questions that come up in this respect, especially when I'm telling the story of Barrack. And the story, I was permitted to tell the story in a certain way, because back in 1994, I began to explore this great mystery. I've explored my story, but who are the people who have lived here for millennia? There's a line in that story. He came from the old world, as my parents called Europe, to the new, only to discover it was far more ancient than the old. And I began to, so one thing led to another, and I met the marvelous Auntie Joy Murphy Wandon, Wurundjeri elder. And when I first visited her in her home, the door opened into 50,000 years of history. She was the grand niece of William Barrack, and she began to take me on a journey to the special places, and I began to in those days. Very few people even knew the word Wurundjeri or Boonwurrung, the coastal people down there in the Bay Area, or Kulin Nation. So this, and it's interesting too, when you tell stories, it's all about context again, because when I first wrote a version of that story back in 1995, that was published in The Age, there was, once again, at last our story is being heard. Nowadays, of course, we step back because they are their own storytellers. So in this story, I'm very careful to write it with permission, but secondly also to see it through those eyes of a Wurundjeri elder, and so in a way I step out.
Do you worry about that trend now in storytelling, that if a person isn't telling the story themselves, if someone else tells their story, it's seen as co-opting their truth, and it's seen as perhaps taking advantage of someone?
Look, once again, yes and no. It comes down to how you do it. It comes down to, I guess, as I've been saying all along, the respect you show, but also, look, there would be no literature if we did not explore different points of view. So the real, there just wouldn't. We'd all be in an echo chamber telling our own stories to ourselves, rather than opening out and having these conversations where we try to meet. That final story is called Where We Meet. And so here, this is at the heart of literature. At the heart of literature is point of view, exploring different points of view, getting beyond the capital I. And so, in a way, at the heart of all the stories in the Watermill is conversation. Most of them began in conversation, whether it's conversation with a person or with a landscape or whatever, and trying to make a connection, and people, and you feel it. So I've never had an issue with this, but look, there are you can do it in such a way that you do co-opt. You can do it in such a way that you do it without respect. And I think the bottom line is that you have had to engage, to have sat quietly and listened. To be a storyteller is to be initially a listener, and also to be in that space where we can see each other and see the perspective. See William Barrack in the 1890s and early 20th century as a wise, dignified elder sitting on the veranda of his house in Corunduk next to his dog. And he's surrounded by mountains that I've now come to know because I go quite often as a place of pilgrimage to Corunduk Cemetery, and I am surrounded by that amphitheatre of mountains and beauty that was his space and his people's space for millennia. So that's what you do. You enter into it fully, and I feel safe when I do that.
We have a few questions from the audience. I just want to get to those, and then we can say goodbye to everyone. The first one being the one that obviously, I'm sure whenever you're seen anywhere, it's a question people ask you is, do you have any current news of Behrouz Booshani?
Okay, I speak to Behrouz regularly. He's in New Zealand. We have to be a bit careful. His status is being determined, but he, like all of us, he's basically staying at home. Look, the wonderful thing Beirut now is that our conversations have shifted, because at the moment he is in freedom, and so we often talk literature. We always did, but now the focus is we're equals as writers, as people that love the art of story. We're having these conversations about his next novel that he's beginning to explore. We talk about the craft and the art, and I think one of the most wonderful moments in my life was going to Christchurch, in November, to those extraordinary events that were put on with Beirut, even engaging in a public event with Beirut. But the highlight was just walking with him through the streets of Christchurch. And here we were. There were moments we'd stop in wonder that after all those years trapped, imprisoned on Manus Island, here we are. Yes, that memory will always stay with me.
Remarkable. Here's another question from Vanessa. What impact do you think COVID-19 will have on our capacity to live together compassionately and humanely and care for those in need?
I think the jury is out, and it's early days. Look, when something like this happens, it can go either way. Events like this can be exploited by political leaders, by certain groups. All kinds of conspiracy theories can be used politically, and also the blame game begins, and also on that negative side, you've got to be very careful about this. What you say about COVID-19, because many people are suffering. Many people are worse off than me. Many people are finding it difficult to put food on the table. Yes, that's one side of it, and we can't kill the lily here. It's a very challenging time. On the other hand, of course, it's quite interesting to see how the neoliberal model, in a way, has collapsed, and people from all across the political spectrum are seeing that in such times, you have to be compassionate. You have to support your people, and health and welfare comes first. And I think in that way, we've learned a lesson, say, from the days of the Great Depression, when the stimulus package, the new packages, the New Deal, as it was called in America, didn't come until several years into the crisis. And so people were suffering greatly for a number of years. So look, it's a mixed question. And for a writer, of course, it's a time to bear witness in a different way, to be alert to all these currents that are moving around all the time.
Like yourself, who likes to write in public spaces, in cafes, outdoors, how has this been?
Well, it's been a challenge. Look, on the one hand, writing is a solitary pursuit. Mm-hmm. And so to be able to sit and write, yes, that's always been a part of me. But I also like contact with humanity. So quite often I have written in cafes, but there is another thing which I do now, which I've always done, and is walk. I love walking, and I love the solitude of walking. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, where I live, there are wonderful parklands, and there's the river. And I actually began a kind of regular post on Facebook. It began with the caption, what we do as the plague approaches, and then it became what we do as the plague descends, and now it's what we do in the time of the plague. And I write about my solitary walks, how certain things give me comfort, but I also write about the men at the mantra hotel in Bell Street, who were on Manus Island all those years and now are imprisoned again and living in distress and fear, and some are petrified. So once again, you try to see the full picture. And yes, you try to see across the spectrum.
And seeing that full picture, we get a long way there with The Watermill. It's Arnold's new book. It's available in all independent bookstores across the country, many of which, by the way, are struggling right now because of this coronavirus lockdown, but are also offering free or discounted delivery. So please do take advantage of that. I think before we wrap things up now, Arnold, is there anything you'd like to send us out with? Any perhaps a portion of the book, something you'd like to read to us as a way of a lullaby or a good night reading?
Look, thank you for the opportunity. There's there's one little passage. Look, one thing you said in the beginning, which I was very, very taken by and pleased by. You talk about the sense of serenity that lies at the heart of a lot of these stories. I mean, this was kind of very important to me, this sense of serenity. It's extraordinary how I met so many people who, despite what had happened to them, had a kind of sense of surrender to their lives and acceptance. This is something that we need now too. This is the impulse we have to try and reach. We have to accept and we have to adjust and adapt. In a way, we're facing what people have always faced in times of crisis. But perhaps the little passage that I'll read at this point would be perhaps something a little bit more. Well, look, let's just read from this passage here that comes towards the end of the book. It's at Corranderk Station. A station wagon pulls up to the bitumen space in front of the cemetery. A young man steps out, unlatches the gate, and makes his way to the cairn. He pauses in front of the plaque and searches. His eyes linger on one name. He runs a finger over it. He steps back and stands for a long while, head bowed, then makes his way to the fence. He sits, legs folded, and looks out over the valley. And I know without having to ask. He has located the name of an ancestor, and I know he's feeling something of what I felt in 1986 in cemeteries on the outskirts of the towns whose names I first heard sung in that distant kitchen: Bryansk, Bialystok, Grudik, Orly, Bielsk, seeking family names among untended gravestones dispersed over fields, hidden in woodlands, sinking into abandoned plots obscured by wild grasses, and of what I felt in Treblinka, where I lit a candle at the stone-marked Bialystok and retreated to a forest of conifers to sit on a floor of raw dirt and pine needles. We sit within the same half acre. We sit as the evening closes in. We sit as the mists begin descending and as the mountains fade to black skylines enfolding rolling farmlands. A flock of migrating birds wings overhead in V formation. A chorus of frogs rises from the dam. The shrill cry of cicadas rings out in the valley. We sit as the land gives way to nightfall. Here is where we meet.
Arnold, thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Sam.
And thank you to the Wheeler Center and as well for organizing this as always, and to Montalto in Red Hill South, who this would have been a part of their Books and Ideas at Montalto series, and I suppose we're still trying to capture some of that magic in our living rooms. And thank you to everyone who tuned in and saw us do so. I'm Sami Shah. Arnold Zable, take care of yourself.
Thank you very much.